So the question was, how do we make money now? Two ways. So on Watsi, when you donate to a patient, you can give an optional tip to fund our overhead. And we try to be really transparent, obviously, about where money is going. And the idea was that, like, if we could tell people that 100% of your money, if it's $5, like every single cent of that is going to go to this patient. And if you fund our overhead, like, here's what our overhead pays for, right? There's this whole conversation around nonprofit overhead and how it, like, shouldn't be demonized, but also there are nonprofit CEOs taking like $250,000 salaries, and that's bad. And our, take on this is just like, just tell people where the money's going and justify it, right? Like, if a nonprofit CEO deserves to make $250,000, like, maybe she does, and like, talk about it and explain it. But that's actually helped us, I think, raise more money for our overhead. So we make about 8% of like our total donation revenue in those optional tips right now, people just opting in. And for comparison, like Kickstarter takes an 8% cut. So that's pretty decent. But like any other startup, right, there's sort of the scaling costs initially. So right now, we also raise what we call philanthropic rounds of funding to cover the cost of like building this infrastructure and hiring engineers. And eventually, the idea is that the growth will continue, but the cost will sort of flatten out over time. So those are funded by technology investors, philanthropists. Foundations have finally come around. They like us now. So that's good. Yeah.
Thank you for your check. Thank you for your talk. I'm just curious, who are your main donors and what is your main motivation for donating to your platform? Because there's so many other crowdfunding platforms that people can donate to homeless people, to kids in rural countries or developing countries. I guess when they go into your site, what's their main motivation to even donate?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think the biggest things are that people are really compelled by the fact that they can not only see where their money is going, but they can get to know the person who it supports. So a lot of people make a very emotional connection on Watsi, right? Like, we talk to donors who, like, the demographics are interesting, right? Like, we have a very techie audience right now because we're a Y Combinator. It's starting to get, more mainstream as we sort of get better with distribution and awareness. But oftentimes you talk to donors about, like, why did you donate, or why did you donate to this one patient? And the things that sort of unify them there tend to be super personal, right? It's like, my mom is in remission from cancer, and this woman in Guatemala has cancer, or I'm from Ghana and this patient is from Ghana, or I have some personal experience that I can relate to. I have 2 little kids, and this little boy loves to play soccer like my kids do. But beyond that, like, I think it's a lot about it's about the model. It's the idea that we're super transparent. People love that we publish all of our operations and financials publicly. They feel like they can trust Watsi as like a connector of them to another person. And I think they also really love that they get real-time sort of impact feedback. So we send updates to donors on every patient they support. And that, I think, feels great too, that your money's not really going into a black hole. You can actually see what it's done. And as far as like why Watsi or why healthcare versus anything else, I think for a lot of people it's just sort of the universal empathy for a health problem. Like, everybody knows what it's like to be sick. And healthcare is one of those foundational things that almost everything else in our lives is built upon. And so it's one of those very basic things that I think most of us would agree everyone deserves access to. And then I think the other thing is there's this sort of striking opportunity to make a really huge difference for a relatively small amount of money, especially in healthcare, especially in the developing world. So we're funding site restoring procedures for $100, funding heart surgeries for $1,200. So I think people are just really surprised by how much of an impact they can make with money that actually feels like something they can part with. Yeah.
Hi, Grace.
Hey.
First of all, I think this platform is really cool.
Oh, thank you.
And it's helping a lot of people, and I like the approach that is bottom up and actually helping directly to the patients. My question is regarding international aid.
Yeah.
So there's an inverse, a relation inversely proportional to international aid with economic development. So that happens probably just in an institutional level instead of like these person-to-person type of funding. So my question is, how sustainable do you think this is going to be, and how is this going to affect or change the way we're aiding other countries?
That's an awesome question. That's one of the things that I thought about most when I was first working in DC and living in a couple other countries, was just like, it's really hard to get behind a program that you feel like you can run 1,000,000 miles an hour behind, because you're just like, you never know what dependencies you're creating or what negative externalities there are. And I think that caused a lot of people, definitely caused me to feel like, oh God, like I'm just gonna like do more harm than good. You know, maybe this isn't something that anyone should be doing. But we think about this a lot, and I think, so one thing is that, you know, despite the fact that it is on like a one-to-one level, Watsi does actually impact institutions and systems more than I think we thought in the beginning. But it's actually something we're pretty excited about. So like, I remember going to visit some of our first partners in East Africa for the first time, and this was really early on in Watsi, and we were thinking a lot about this stuff, and we sat down with the administrators of some of the hospitals that we were working with, and just sort of asked them, like, is there something else we should be funding? Like, should we be funding, you know, a new wing of a hospital or an ambulance, or like something that feels more, you know, systemic to help these, you know, healthcare systems emerge? And he looked at me and he was like, no. He's like, don't do anything else, because what you have to understand is that a hospital is like a business, and to sustain itself and grow, it needs to be able to collect like a fair market price from the customer. And all of these hospitals that we're working with, and you find this a lot around the world, have these dual missions to provide high quality healthcare to people in need. And the problem is that like, to provide high quality healthcare, you have to get paid a lot to like produce that quality. But to serve people in need, you need to be able to not charge them an arm and a leg and force them to like go into debt to pay out of pocket for healthcare, because there's no safety net to support them. And so all these hospitals end up either like turning people away, they provide high quality healthcare to a very small group of people that they can afford to cover the cost for, or they like go into the red and don't invest in their own growth and the growth of their health system, because they're just trying to like react to people coming in the door, and they want to be able to say yes. And so what he told us, and what we've sort of seen since, is that by covering the fair cost of care for every patient and making sure that surgeons are getting paid and new doctors are getting trained and supplies are being paid for, and you know, they can invest in, you know, a community health worker program, and they can invest in tying up with other hospitals, we're actually enabling hospitals in these systems to sort of expand. So it's something that like there's not totally a precedent for yet, because like we're working in areas where the, you know, development of a health system is going to happen a lot differently than the development of like our health system here, for example. Like, I actually think health systems in many developing countries have sort of an unfair advantage against health systems here, because they're going to leapfrog all this like crappy technology that we have. They're going to go straight to like electronic medical records. All of Watsi's partner hospitals are already using data to make decisions about care and all of this stuff. And I think another opportunity is like thinking about the way that we fund healthcare, right? Like, every healthcare system at a basic level is just like crowdfunding. It's like taxation. Everybody pays a little bit into this pot, and then it gets paid out, and hopefully that covers the cost of care for people. But like, it's been too expensive to provide that kind of like a service as like a country's, you know, develops.
And it's not sustainable.
Exactly, it's not sustainable, because like, even if a company was going to do that, the cost of like collecting payments from someone way out in a rural area, and then bringing those payments back, and then like going to get them if they need healthcare, it's just so expensive that like they pass that cost on to the patient, and they can't afford to pay. And so many of these countries are like too small also to sustain that cost themselves, and also to spread out risk among enough people. So like, long-winded way of saying, there's going to be a global healthcare insurance system. Like, there's going to be a way that risk is distributed across like much larger populations, and that somebody is in the middle collecting prepayments, even if they're super tiny, from patients, and spreading things out. And hopefully like Watsi can support governments, right? Like, hopefully, I think it would make a lot more sense if in 5 or 10 years, if the health ministry of Kenya wants to allocate $15 million towards healthcare, instead of doing it through like 15 subcontractors like they might do now, and seeing maybe 10% of that actually end up with hospitals, they should do it through Watsi, because we're already working with all their hospitals, and 100% of that money can fund healthcare for people in their country. So we have lots of ideas about this, but it's a long way of saying we're thinking about it too.
Governments would be better off if they donate Watsi instead of Watsi donating to doing the funding to the government?
Yeah.
Because it's much more.
It's more
efficient.
direct. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we'll see.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Allison Hendricks. I really liked your platform. I really like the human aspect of it. So my question is, there's many issues around the world, like i.e. grip killing, like slave labor, and I'm wondering if you guys are interested in expanding into these other industries, or if you feel like there's too much competition from Indiegogo and other platforms.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's sort of two parts to our focus right now. One is just that we really want to focus. We really want to be the best in the world at one thing before we consider moving on to anything else. And this is sort of a classic trap that nonprofits fall into also, is that because you're constantly chasing funding, it's like if someone comes to Watsi and they're like, hey, we really like your platform, but like we want to fund you guys expanding into education or into this other area, it's so tempting to be like, oh, you like what we're doing? Okay, yeah, we'll take this money and we'll go do that too. We can be the best at everything. But then you just end up sort of standing in a shallow pool and you're not that great at anything. So that's one reason we really want to focus. The other one is just that, yeah, we're sort of curious to see like what else springs up for other causes. And yeah, there's also, people ask us a lot, like, are you ever going to do Watsi in the United States? And that's one where like, it's less sort of like, you know, competition, but more like the fundraising is just a little bit different. And I think I would love for Watsi to be everywhere eventually. I think right now we're just focused on developing countries and healthcare because you can have the most impact with the least amount of money. But it's also interesting because on Watsi, we're usually fundraising for patients that don't have access to their own networks of people that could collectively raise enough money for their healthcare, right? Like if they weren't doing Watsi, they would be going out and taking out a loan, right, with a crazy repayment rate, or they would be, you know, not getting care at all. Whereas in the US, like there's huge problems accessing healthcare here as well, but you know, people usually have access to the internet themselves. They can go on Give Forward or Indiegogo, and you know, most people through their networks can raise more money here than somewhere else. But that all is going to change a ton, right? Like in the next 5 years, every Watsi patient's going to be on Facebook, so it's going to be a lot different. Yeah. Thanks.
How do you ensure funds actually get to where they're meant to go? So like you and, you know, before there's like food drops, right? And then
Yeah.
a rebel army comes and 50 cows and grabs all the rice or grabs all the food, takes off. How do you ensure that your funds are actually used appropriately?
Yeah, so a couple ways. One is through pretty unheard of transparency. So we promise that to our donors, but that also means that we impose that on our partners. So we ask our partners and provide technology for them to do this, to report on more than you get from any health system anywhere, right? So we get information about, you know, the patient, name, age, condition, all this stuff, the doctor that submitted them, the date they were admitted, you know, photos of the waivers that they signed, photo evidence of like before, after treatment, all this kind of stuff. So like, there's a lot of transparency as sort of like one forcing function. The other one is that we have been able to scale and in some ways, hopefully this will be a big focus of ours in the next year or so, automate auditing and ongoing due diligence once we've partnered with an organization. So there are certain things that, you know, we've historically like manually checked for, like, you know, following up with a patient, right? We'll like randomly select out of 10 patients, like here's one that like we want to like talk to them and like verify X, Y, Z, or we'll visit a partner and we'll do sort of like an, you know, unannounced series of like interviews or whatever. We'll do auditing on data that we get, right? Like the treatment timeline is really important to us, right? It's like, did this happen like 6 months ago or is it now, right? Like, are you backfilling patients? And we work with, you know, the most trusted medical organizations in the world. So like there's a lot that we can put in that, but being able to check, right? Like timestamps on photos with a program that just like runs this and flags inconsistencies for us has been a good way for us to sort of scale and automate some of the auditing and due diligence on all of that data that we collect up front.
Thanks.
I really love the impact stories in Guatemala, and so I run a blog CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Oh, cool.
So I would really love to feature that impact story.
Yeah, of course.
And I have two quick questions. The first is the story behind the name Watsi. Like, how did you come up with the name?
Yeah.
And the second one is like, what are the challenges of starting a crowdfunding platform in nonprofits? Like, especially if you don't have an NGO background or you're working with nonprofits. Like, if you come from an IT background or tech background, if you wanted to start like a crowdfunding platform.
Yeah. So the Watsi story is a good one. So Chase, who had the original idea for Watsi, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Costa Rica. And he had an experience towards the end of his Peace Corps stint where he was on a bus and a woman got on the bus and started asking all of the local passengers for donations to pay for her son's health care. And he sort of tuned her out, right? Like you sort of see, he thought she was selling something, you sort of see this all the time. But then he noticed that like every single Costa Rican farmer on the bus was pulling out all the money they had and giving it to her. And it was because she'd been carrying around her son's medical record with her. And she'd been traveling from bus to bus to bus. They were now stopped in a town called Watsi, asking people for support and telling them her story. And he'd had friends working in San Francisco and in tech, and he sort of made this connection. He was like, we can crowdfund creative projects on Kickstarter, we can crowdfund education projects on Donors Choose. Like, why in the world is there no way to crowdfund healthcare for someone like this woman and her son? So that's how he came up with the idea, and he happened to be in a town called Watsi, and so the name stuck. As far as creating a crowdfunding platform, what's the hardest part? It's funny because I think you asked from the perspective of someone who's like in tech, and you're like, how do you do something when you don't know anything about nonprofits? For us, it was the opposite. It was like we were like nonprofit-y people, and we were like, okay, we know what we need to build, but like, how do we actually build this crowdfunding platform thing? So for us, the hardest part was actually like finding someone to build the technology and figure out like how all of these logistics should work on the back end and how could we make them really efficient. And not just sort of like throw people at a problem. If you're in tech, I would say like, I think the most important thing for anyone who wants to do something useful for anyone else, whether it's a user of your app or like a beneficiary of a nonprofit program, is to go spend a lot of time with the people you're trying to design something for, right? Like I think the biggest mistake that any like failed company and certainly malfunctioning nonprofit makes is trying to produce some kind of a product when they haven't spent time with the people who are going to use it, and they haven't asked them what they want. So I think that informed probably most of our thinking around like what's going to be useful for hospitals, what do patients need, what are donors going to want out of this, was really just like putting ourselves in their shoes and going and spending a lot of time with the first hospitals to use Watsi, like going to Guatemala and like watching them, seeing where they get hung up on the process and seeing where we can make things easier for patients, seeing where patients don't understand Watsi, and like how can we help explain that better. And so, yeah, I would say for someone who like maybe doesn't know a lot about nonprofits, figure out what you're interested in, and then before you decide what you think would be a cool solution, like go spend some time with like individual people who are having these problems or could benefit from a solution and see what their ideas are, because they're probably better than ours.